Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming to my talk. My name is Xiaofan. I'm an assistant professor from DISA. Today, I'm going to share my work on blockchain security and the collision formation of its writers. This is a joint work with Andrew Winston from UT Austin. So as you came to this talk, I guess you heard about blockchain and probably has some basic knowledge about it. So it is a ledger writing technology, and the ledgers could record various information, including identity information, production information, financial transactions, and many others. And in other words, blockchain technologies are applicable in many situations. Probably some of you are actually working on some specific applications and may even know more details about those applications than I do. But no matter what area is one trying to apply blockchain into, it is about ledgers. And ledger as a tool to record information, one of its most important features will be its security and integrity. So in this research, we want to understand what are the determinants of the security and integrity of blockchains, especially those based on proof of work systems. So the most significant characteristic that differentiates blockchains, especially public blockchains, from traditional ledgers is the decentralization of its writers, meaning that the transactions recorded on the ledger or some other information recorded on the ledger is not determined by a centralized authority. Instead, it is determined by the consensus of multiple writers. And as there are multiple writers, they may have disagreements on something. So we need a consensus algorithm to resolve those disagreements. And the consensus algorithm of most public blockchains, including the Bitcoin network, is a proof of work system. So throughout this talk, when I talk about a blockchain, you may just think about Bitcoin network as an example. And actually, that's what I'm thinking about when doing this research. So in the Bitcoin network, when the writers disagree on which transactions are valid and should be recorded, they will generate different blocks that include those different transaction data. And then to support the transactions that they think are valid, they will work on new blocks following those different blocks, and that will lead to forks. And usually the longest fork is that with the most computational power working on it. And therefore, it is usually considered the ledger of consensus. There is actually some arguments around about how should one recognize what is the ledger of consensus, but we will not go into that deeply today. We will just go with the assumption that the longest fork is the ledger of consensus. And we see that Bitcoin is kind of working just fine. And there are some other major cryptocurrencies that are also working smoothly. So like there can be like an idea that the proof of work system is fine. It is providing security and integrity to the system. However, at the same time, those proof of work consumes a significant amount of electricity, and that will lead to significant amount of pollution. And as probably everyone of you know, that now the climate is a problem in the world. You will see on the news, there is flood somewhere, there is extreme heat somewhere else in the world. There will always be those climate problems. So the proof of work systems are adding to that problem. It is generating a lot of pollution. A recently published paper actually shows that the emission output of mining Bitcoin only in China would exceed the total annualized greenhouse gas emission output of Czech Republic and Qatar. So kind of like two middle-sized countries. Pollution without like really producing too much products. It just kind of provides service to Bitcoin. And if Bitcoin price keeps rising, if Bitcoin becomes a more prominent currency around, we can expect more pollution. So the question is, does this environmental cost worth it? In other words, is this guess of random number? You know what I mean. You need to calculate the hash functions and so on to win the block. is this guess of random number essential to the integrity of the system? This goes back to our previous question. What determines the security and integrity of such a consensus algorithm? If really the proof of work system relies on the computational power working on it, and that's the only way to provide a secure cryptocurrency, then probably we need to live with it. And that's actually the argument from the original paper by someone using the name of Nakamoto, saying that the system is secure when no single miner owns more than half of the computational power. In other words, an attacker needs to own more computational power than the aggregation of all existing miners to be able to successfully attack the system. Therefore, the amount of the aggregated computational power of the existing miners of a proof of work system is the only determinant to its security and integrity. So from this argument, we will see that we really probably just need to live with it. We need this computational power to support such a cryptocurrency. But I need to have a but here. Otherwise, I'm just summarizing a conventional wisdom. I'm not really proposing my new idea. So, but is this argument is based on the assumption that the miners behave independently of each other. In other words, the miners are assumed to be not communicating and coordinating with each other. So the miners are kind of working on their own. They receive information probably broadcasted transaction information just by themselves, and they have no one to talk to. They just work on, they can only see one fork over there, which is the one that records all the transactions, and generally they just work as the portal designed. So in this case, that's true. It's kind of those miners are just honest miners. And for a single attacker to be able to attack the system, he needs to own more computational power than all the existing miners do. But this assumption may be favorable when there are thousands or millions of miners working on a blockchain. There are so many of them, and each of them is a small player. So it's difficult for them to coordinate on something. But practically, there are usually only a small number of significant miners in the proof of work systems. So this is a pie chart of the hash rate distribution of Bitcoin network. So we can see that this part, the biggest part, is unknown. So this part may consist of thousands or millions of people using laptops, or people just curious about what's going on, people trying to learn about it, or just some small miners around. So this part is probably the aggregation of many small miners. But other than this part, all the other parts are some like significant mining pools. We can see from the name, it shows that there are mining pools like FP2, F2 pool, Ant pool, pooling, shows that they are kind of pools. And each of them is having like a big proportion over here. We can see that if we want to have a successful attack, we need more than 50% of the computational power, meaning that if we can coordinate 4 of the biggest miners, we already have more than half of the computational power. And if we coordinate maybe 7, 8 here, we are almost having 3/4 of the computational power. So this pie chart kind of shows that there is not that many, or well, there are probably many small players, but the computational power are not mainly owned by those small players. It's mainly owned by a few big players. And this is actually economically reasonable. First, because there is significant scale of economics from huge mining factories. So if you own a mining factories, the cost of computational power per unit will be probably much lower than if you are just using a laptop. And second, like guessing the number, mining the block has some risk to it. It is a stochastic process. So people may want to work together to share the risk. So these 2 points make it economically rational to be big players. And at the same time, this is a competitive market. The mining is a competitive market. And as the nature of all competitive market, if someone is more cost efficient then someone else probably will just quit the business. So in other words, it is economically rational to see mainly big players over there. And there are only a few of those big players over there, and they are possible to coordinate and act strategically. Technically, that's also possible because the miners could just communicate with each other with the knowledge of each other's identity on the blockchain. This is because cryptocurrencies usually use public key cryptography. And I will not really go into cryptography here, and I guess you probably have some ideas about what public key cryptography is. So basically, each owner of a cryptocurrency, including the miners, has a pair of public key and private key. And to authenticate a transaction, the owner of the cryptocurrency digitally signs the transaction with the owner's private key, and everyone else can validate the signature with the owner's public key. At the same time, those pairs of keys and the digital signature mechanisms is not limited to the blockchain itself. It can be used off the blockchain or maybe on other blockchains. So also they can send encrypted messages by using those pairs of keys. Therefore, they can actually credibly show his or her identity on the blockchain to others on other platforms, such as social networks, the dark web, and even other blockchains, because the pair of keys can be carried over to other platforms. Therefore, they can just carry out off-chain communications, knowing others' identity on the chain when preferred. In the same manner, there can be off-chain transactions. Actually, there are some platform designed for off-chain transactions. For example, the Lightning Network. It is using the same identity as Bitcoin. So people just keep the same identity across those two platforms. And the Lightning Network is designed to have some off-chain transactions. Here, the off-chain meaning off the Bitcoin network, but having its own blockchain. Similarly, there can be apps designed for smart contracts that use the same identity of Bitcoin network, but is using another blockchain to record it. With all those possibilities of off-chain transactions and communications, we will think that an attacker probably does not need to build all the computational power by himself or herself, because the attacker now can instead try to collaborate with some of the miners by, for example, bribing them to work for the attack. Because he can communicate with the miners and he can have transactions to the miners, so he does not need to buy all the computational power. For example, if we look at this pie chart, if he may just bribe those 4 most significant miners to let them work for him, and then he can just have a successful attack. In other words, the attacker can instead try to form an attacking coalition among the miners to attack the system. However, at the same time, the miners could have a preference to keep the blockchain system secure. First, as miners, you are mining Bitcoins, you probably don't sell every Bitcoin when you mine it. You probably keep some of the Bitcoin in your hand, or maybe if you really believe that Bitcoin will go up in the future, you may have additional investments in it. So generally, those miners probably have some investments in the blockchain's native cryptocurrency. And we can expect that if a major attack, a double spending attack is happening to a cryptocurrency, cryptocurrencies price nowadays are highly speculative. So a lot of investors are just looking at it. Clearly, such an attack will really make people doubt the security of the blockchain. And from a speculative perspective, the value of the cryptocurrency will significantly drop. And even just not speculative, people's demand for it will also significantly drop because people just think, I probably will not use this currency. It is not that secure. So the value of those investments in the blockchain's native cryptocurrency will drop. And from this perspective, the miner may have a preference to keep the system secure. And another similar point is that the mining hardware that the miners own will also depreciate if an attack happens. And the third point is that those miners could be related to other entities that are highly dependent on the blockchain system. For example, investors, exchanges, and cyber criminals. Cyber criminals like ransomware attackers, their business is really dependent on Bitcoin. So those entities may have preference to keep the blockchain system secure, and they may have ways to connect with the miners and such that the miners can reflect their interests. So from this perspective, the miners could also try to form a defensive coalition to act against a potential attack. Actually, there was an example on the Bitcoin Cash cryptocurrency. There was once that someone is trying to attack the system, and two of its most significant miners on the Bitcoin Cash platform work together to defend against the attack. So in this paper, we are actually trying to look at how the coalitions are formed, what is the process of the coalition formation, and what is the output of it. Actually, this system and these interactions is analogous to a majority voting system, determining whether the attack is successful. So kind of think about miners is analogous to a legislator and has a certain number of votes. Here, the certain number of votes correspond to the amount of computational power they own. And they want to vote on determine whether the attack is successful or not. And the attacker can buy votes through bribing some miners. And at the same time, the miners can communicate and make side payments among themselves so that honest miners can also try to buy some bribed miners back. So maybe the attacker is bribing 5 miners to attack, and the other miners are bribing 2 among the 5 back to defend. So there is such an interaction. There can be such an interaction over there. Actually, Grosclose and Snyder has a paper discuss the majority voting system, the traditional majority voting system, and talks about how such a buying votes process can happen there and what is the optimal strategy for the attacker or for like one party to buy the votes in the traditional sense. So they show that it is optimal to buy a supermajority of the votes, meaning that if you want to win the vote, probably what you want to buy is not 51% of the vote. It is more than that. You may want to buy 80% of the vote, and that's actually more cost effective. The intuition behind this is that if one side buys only 51% of the votes, then the other side only needs to buy 1% back to win the voting. And therefore, the former side needs to pay every one of the 51% of the voters a very high bribe, because as long as he pays someone among the 51%, not that much, it is very easy for the opponent to just bribe this 1% back. So to make sure not every 1% cannot be bribed back, you need to bribe every one of the 51%, a significant amount of bribe. But if you are bribing 80% of the voters, the opponent needs to bribe 30% back. And actually, you are paying less to bribe the 80% of the votes because you need to pay each much less. So a more cost-effective way is actually to buy a supermajority of the votes. And the same intuition actually holds for proof-of-work systems too. We formalize this intuition with the following model. So I will not go into all the details of the model. I will just kind of give an illustration of it. So in our model, there are 2 forks, an honest fork and an attacking fork. And if the attacking fork is longer than the honest one, the attack is successful and a double spending will happen. And there are n+2 entities in our game. 1 attacker, n strategic miners, and 1 non-strategic miner. So the non-strategic miner is the unknown part of the pie chart. It is an aggregation of miners who are not mining for economic reasons and whose computational power are not significant. So you can think about this as the unknown part in the pie chart. And n strategic miners are the rest, the big miners over there. And we have 1 attacker. And each miner has a certain amount of computational power, and each strategic miner has a certain amount of preference for a secure and integral system. And the game among the miners is modeled as a 4-stage game with perfect information. In the first stage, the attacker decides whether to attack. If he decides to attack, he proposes a schedule of bribes for each miner to work on the attacking for. So he will say, for miner 1 that has, for example, 10 volts, meaning here 10 units of computational power and a certain preference for the security of the system, I offer this amount of bribe. And for another miner who owns a different amount of computational power and has a different amount of preference towards the security of the system, I offer a different amount of bribe. So basically it comes up with a schedule of bribes. And then the second step is that the miners decide whether they are satisfied with the attacker's offer or not. They can be either satisfied with it or not. And what does that mean? Goes to the third step. For the unsatisfied miners, they come together. They propose a schedule of bribes for the satisfied miners to work on the honest fork. So there can be a certain amount of miners who are not moved by the attacker's offer, and they decide to continue to be honest. And the attacker may be bribing already more than 51% of the computational power to work on the attack. And those miners, those unsatisfied miners, may want to bribe some of the miners that are bribed by the attacker back to work on the honest fork. So the unsatisfied miners will propose a schedule of bribes for the satisfied miners to come back to work on the honest fork. And finally, each miner decides whether and on which fork to work on. And finally, the offers are realized depending on their decisions in the end. And the solution concept we use for this game is called perfectly collision-proof equilibrium. It is a refinement of the subgame perfect equilibrium. So I guess if you're familiar with game theory, you know what subgame perfect equilibrium is. And this solution concept is a refinement of that because the rationality described in the subgame perfect equilibrium is not enough for our case where the players can communicate with each other. When they can communicate with each other, even if everyone is having their best response, they may figure out by moving together, they can come up with a better payoff for both of them. So a perfectly collision-proof equilibrium is a subgame perfect equilibrium where no subset of players can all be better by deviating from their strategies together. So this includes a rationality where players can communicate. And with this solution concept, we come to the conclusion, the result, that the attacker will either bribe all strategic miners to attack or just decide not to attack. If he realizes that bribing all the strategic miners actually costs him more money than what he can earn from the attacker will just decide not to attack. So this will be the result. And there can be some extensions because the attackers and the miners clearly can introduce new computational power. This is the difference from traditional majority voting systems. In majority voting, the amount of votes is fixed. But in the proof of work systems, everyone, including the attackers and miners, they can always introduce new computational power to this competition. And with this possibility included, we come to the following result. So the attacker will choose one from the following three options. First, still bribe all strategic miners to attack. And second, buy all computational power on his own to attack. So he will not use a mixed strategy between those two. So he will not say bribe a certain amount of miners and buy some of computational power. No, he will be optimal through either bribe all strategic miners or buy all computational power on his own, or just decide not to attack. Now, with this result, we need to go back to our previous research question. Think about what is the determinants of the security of a proof-of-work system. So here we show that having enough computational power working on a proof-of-work system is only a necessary condition for its safety, because it is a necessary condition, because if you don't have too much enough computational power on it, the attacker will just decide to buy computational power to attack. So we need to have enough computational power, but it is only a necessary condition, not a sufficient one. Another necessary condition is that the miners need to have enough preferences to keep the system secure. Otherwise, they will be bribed to attack. So if we think about the miners are indifferent of whether the attack is successful or not, they just care about mining. They don't care what forks they are mining for. And in that case, no matter how much computational power they own, they can be easily bribed by the attacker and taken advantage by the attacker to have a successful attack. So no matter how much computational power is there, as long as the miners do not have enough preferences, the system is still very prone to a double spending attack. So in other words, for those systems that are running smoothly now, like Bitcoin, it shows that the miners actually have enough preferences to keep them secure. And their computational power is not the only determinant for the security of the system. And now the question is, with such preferences over there, is the pollution that proof-of-work systems generate still worth it? In other words, are there any other systems that are possible to reflect the miners' preferences for a secure system? And actually, proof-of-work is not the only way to reflect interest, and actually not even the best one. There is also the proof-of-work, a proof-of-stake system, where the influence of each writer depends on the amount of currency, the native currency associated with the Bitcoin that the writer owns. And this system can actually better reflect the writer's interests, because it actually better aligns the writer's value, because the writer's value comes from their investment in the cryptocurrency. So it actually better aligns the writer's value and their influence on the integrity of the system. So you are giving the people who have more preference for a secure system a higher amount of votes. So in that sense, it reflects the writer's preferences for a secure system better than a proof-of-work system do. And another important part of it is that there is no significant consumption of energy for proof-of-stake systems. It doesn't need the huge proof-of-work over there. But the question is it easy to move from a proof-of-work system to a proof-of-stake system? Moving from proof-of-work to proof-of-stake is actually changing the fundamental rules of a blockchain system. And you may know it, Ethereum is actually trying to implement this change. Ethereum's plan is to first gradually increase the difficulty of the proof-of-work system until barely any miners exist, and then to switch to a proof-of-stake system. So it's trying to have like a gradual change between those two significantly different portals. However, such a movement will clearly change the power structure among the writers. So if we think about it as like a traditional political system, as we already did when making an analogy to a majority voting system, this is actually like a coup to the system. You are making some people losing the power and someone else gaining the power. Therefore, clearly for such a change, some will be in favor of it and some will be against it. So especially the proof of work miners, they are the ones who lose the power. They have the power in the current proof of work systems, but may lose the power in the future proof of stake systems if they're not significant investors of the cryptocurrency. So those proof of work miners that has power now due to the investment in the mining hardware, they will be against such a change. And actually for the Ethereum case, there is an organization. Maybe there are other organizations, but this is the one that I found. I saw like their tweets on Twitter having like arguments, people should work on proof of work systems and how proof of stake is not a good one. He has all those kind of arguments on their tweets. So this Ethereum Foundation is an organization of people against the change. They actually have campaigns against the change. For example, on April 15th this year, they completed a hard fork on Ethereum. They call it the Maple fork to save the proof of work community. It's kind of like a political party over there and organizing campaigns, arguing for their interests and values. So we see that it is challenging for Ethereum. Actually, I remember they are talking about making the change maybe 2 or even 3 years ago. And they are saying that when I check their website, they're always saying they are completing it soon. But as of now, that's still the same on their website. They're still saying that completing this movement from proof of work to proof of stake soon, but still they are not, it's still not completed. So it is challenging for Ethereum, but could be harder for Bitcoin, maybe impossible for Bitcoin for a few reasons. First, there are much more computing power working on Bitcoin, so there will be much more resistance. And second, the proof of work group working on Ethereum may also have less resistance because of the existence of Bitcoin over there. They can just, instead of work on Bitcoin, if the Ethereum portal moves to a proof of stake system, they can just instead work on Bitcoin instead of losing everything. And third, Ethereum has an organization, the Ethereum Foundation, that can force changes to the system. Clearly, the writers can disagree with the changes as a public blockchain and decentralized blockchain. Writers can disagree, and they can thus initiate hard forkings. And actually, this happened. The hard forking is probably one of the most famous hard forkings in cryptocurrency history. It's a hard forking to Ethereum Classic. It is a significant hard forking. Actually, both of the forks still exist now. And that shows the writers' disagreement to some decision that the Ethereum Foundation made. So we will not go into that today, but that's actually an interesting story if you didn't know it and want to have some ideas about how hard forkings are happening. And the recent Maple fork we mentioned just now also showed some disagreement. But it seems that because there is a leader over there, there is an organization over there, the most will follow the changes as long as the changes are reasonable. So in the hard forking to the Ethereum Classic case, around 90% of the miners actually follows the changes that the Ethereum Foundation is proposing. But Bitcoin does not have such a leader, at least apparently. So any changes to Bitcoin can be much more challenging. So in that sense, maybe an easier way is instead of trying to make Bitcoin make the change, instead have a competing cryptocurrency that is similar to Bitcoin, has the features that Bitcoin has, but based on proof of stake. It's just like a wild thought over here. Maybe have a cryptocurrency that's similar to Bitcoin in terms of provides privacy and to some extent stable monetary policy and hopefully has an ecosystem around it. So there clearly is an ecosystem around Bitcoin, but that's probably the most difficult part, is to build an ecosystem around the cryptocurrency. So maybe like to force Bitcoin changing from proof of work to proof of stake, an easier way is actually to propose a competing cryptocurrency that is based on proof of stake. So some future directions of our research. First, our model is clearly a simplification of real-world interactions. And the biggest simplification we made is that we assumed perfect communication in our model. Practically, it cannot be perfect communication. For example, the preference that each miner has is probably some private knowledge to the miner himself. And he may want to communicate it to others, but he may not want to just write it on the public and let everyone know about it. He may want to kind of trade that information for some value. So that's kind of the typical partial information game idea over there. But here, kind of, we made a simplification to differentiate from the conventional assumption that the miners are just independent of each other. They are just working on their own and have no communication of each other. That's clearly to another extreme. So there are two extremes here. One is that there is just no communications. And we are talking about another extreme. We are modeling another extreme where there is perfect communication. Practically, it should be in between. There are some communications among the miners, but not perfect. So in that sense, the information structure on the values and offers is unclear, and that needs more studies into it. And second, the process of the interactions can be more nuanced. For example, if you look at GitHub, look at Reddit, look at Twitter, and maybe look at some forums on the dark web, you can see that those miners are interacting with each other. And all of those nuanced interactions can be part of their general interactions. So some empirical studies into those nuanced part of these interactions will also contribute significantly in understanding where in between do the reality lays between the two extreme assumptions. But as we said before, we believe that the perspective of studying the interactions among the writers, instead of just naively assuming them to be independent of each other, is critical in understanding public blockchains. And another part that is also significantly relevant is to understand the ecosystem around the cryptocurrency. So what are the relevant parties' interests in the integrity of the blockchain? How are those relevant parties' interests reflected in the system? So if we make the analogy with traditional political system, it's like we have the legislators over there, but we also have the lobbyists behind them. So what are the lobbyists' interests? How are the lobbyists' interests reflected by the legislators? That's another thing that needs to be understood. But answering these questions needs a comprehensive understanding of the whole ecosystem around the cryptocurrencies, including the investors, exchanges, users like cyber criminals. So those parts are probably all in favor of the integrity of the blockchain. And the governments can have like different roles over there. For example, if they have their sovereign currencies competed by a cryptocurrency, they may be against it. And if they are, for example, trying to tackle cyber criminals, they may be against it. For example, now in like US and Europe, there is a kind of know your customer proposal saying that for those cryptocurrency exchanges, you need to know your customer. And this is proposed to against cyber criminals and money laundering. So in that sense, it is kind of reducing the privacy that Bitcoin has, and in that sense, maybe reducing the usage of Bitcoin. So they may have like kind of like different interests in the cryptocurrency, and how their interests are reflected is something to be understood. Okay, so that's it for my talk today. Any questions? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lee Xiaofan. Good morning. I will be welcoming the questions here. There is a question that you said miners can interact via Reddit, Twitter, etc. How do you identify such interactions? What could a practical example of major mining pools colluding to gain more than 50% of the mining power in Bitcoin?
Sure. Thanks for the question. So yeah, it's a very good question. First, I said miners can interact. How do I identify such interactions? Yeah, that's a thing like kind of future. I mean, it's kind of, if you just look at Twitter, for example, you just search this like Ethereum group I mentioned in the talk. I think it's called Ethereum Foundation, something like that. They are kind of having a campaign over there and having like arguing for proof of work systems. So under their tweets, there are a lot of interactions. So kind of they talk about something and other miners are talking about something and other like this investors or the speculators around, they are talking about something. So in that sense, it's kind of like not directly communicating with each other, but you can see some like kind of nuanced interactions over there. And
yeah, you mean it's a practical attack example?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that would be the second question, like a practical example of attack. So I wouldn't say I have like a practical attack example, but what I see is kind of a practical defense example. So there was a case on Bitcoin Cash where there is someone trying to attack the system, and two of the largest miners on the system actually work together. They put their basically computational power together to act against that potential attack. And finally, the attack is not successful.
Okay, so yeah, so we have another question here. Is virtual mining actually a kind of POS system?
Is virtual mining actually? Yeah, I mean, I'm not like, I'm not that familiar with all the details about virtual mining, but just from my understanding, I think it's kind of a proof of stake system. Yeah.
Okay, great. So, and also, would it be possible to mix several proof of system that can be implemented that can make the system more secure?
First, it is for sure possible to mix several proof of systems. I think currently in the current Ethereum is kind of probably not that much into proof of stake, but at least they are kind of moving from proof of work to proof of stake gradually. And currently it's kind of a mix now. And second, whether this can make the system more secure, that's a question I guess I cannot just like say it is a yes or no thing. It definitely depends on how it is really implemented and what are the like potential attacks coming from. So I think that will be like a case by case answer to that.
I see. So yeah, we have another questions. In the model, do the sum of the attackers' offers have an upper limit? If yes, is the limit based on the attacker's own stock or the total amount of stock all strategic miners can own after a successful attack?
Do the offer, I mean, it's kind of, if you think about it as like the attacker is also strategic player over there. He is not like trying to just destroy the system at all costs. So to that extent, at least the one limit is that he wouldn't spend more than he would get after the attack. So in that sense, that would be an upper limit of what he would like to offer to have a successful attack.
Okay, great. So regarding the model you described in analyzing the security of POW systems, the model partitions miners into strategic and non-strategic miners and assume that miners can be bought. How effectively does this capture the dynamics of the situation, wherein, as you mentioned, miners with more computational power are likely to be more invested in the system and thus need higher bribes?
Yes, exactly. the miners who invested more in the system will need higher bribes. And that's kind of the argument I have for why currently the systems are working smoothly. Like currently Bitcoin doesn't suffer from this kind of attacks because there are already enough investment in the system so that they wouldn't be bribed by some attacker over there. And in terms of the difference between strategic and non-strategic ones, I just assume all individuals who invested heavily into the game is strategic. They are kind of economic. They need to be economically rational in this whole process. And what I mean by non-strategic miners are like those small ones who, for example, like a student using their laptop to have a try of, well, what is cryptocurrency, what is blockchain, or someone just doing something small for fun. It's kind of like those small mining power all around the world. Maybe in aggregation, they come up, they add to some reasonable amount of computational power. If we look at the chart, it's probably 20% of the computational power. And that's what I mean by non-strategic miners. But for those big mining pools, I think a basic economic assumption is that they are economically rational, so that they are, in our sense, strategic.
I see. Okay, great. Thanks for the answer. And another question is, if rollback attacks, for example, permanently erasing blockchain hashes, eventually succeed, will this change the behavior of major cryptocurrency players?
Yeah, that's a kind of subjective question. I would subjectively say yes, and I think we will very significantly change the dynamics, because currently I would say cryptocurrencies are highly speculative, and people are thinking about it as they are thinking about it. They may become major currencies around in the future and replace some sovereign currencies in the future. That's kind of at least some speculations around. And that is for sure based on an assumption that the system is secure. I mean, for currency, if it is not secure, if the ledger of it is not secure, no one will use it. So in that sense, my analogy to that, if such an attack happens, is kind of like a bank is losing it. People is losing the faith of a bank, and people will just rush out of the bank. So in that sense, it will significantly change the behavior. But that's kind of my subjective view for that.
Okay, great. So another related questions that maybe nowadays we ransomware, and ransomware is primarily being driven by cryptocurrency, allowing cross-border attacks like cross-country and so on and so forth. How will this affect the future development of cryptocurrencies?
At least for now, we can see that US and Europe is taking actions against cryptocurrencies to ask cryptocurrency exchanges to know your customer. In that sense, it is kind of at least limiting the privacy that cryptocurrencies can provide. And for sure, those things can affect the future development of cryptocurrency. So in that sense, it's kind of, if someone is really trying to develop a cryptocurrency and try to kind of be nice to the world, be nice to the governments, maybe he wants to think about those things, how to make those criminal behaviors maybe limited in those cryptocurrencies so that this currency can be more accepted by probably every society.
I see. Okay, great. So there's also some questions that are interested in the more towards POS. So the POS versus POW, I think is still interesting today. I saw some also asking about it. Could you please explain more on the dynamics between these two? For example, if you compare in general, and then to what sense or in what directions this POS could be a better, more likable solution in the future.
Yeah, I kind of I think currently the climate thing is clearly a big thing in the world. So I personally would say if proof of stake system can have the same properties as a proof of work system, they are definitely preferable to the society. But how to make the switch, that's what I see the challenge. It's kind of I'm kind of pessimistic about seeing the current Bitcoin moving into a proof of stake system. That's what why I proposed having just a new competing cryptocurrency, and to see that this new cryptocurrency may kind of outcompete Bitcoin one day. Maybe some central bank digital currency, something like that.
Okay, great. So maybe last question that we have. If major mining pools join hands to defend against some attacks because of their stakes in the system, does that mean there is no problem with the security of the system, even when the aggregated power is more than 50%?
Yes, I think so. I think that could actually be happening right now. I mean, if we just look at the current systems from my perspective, I would say kind of those major hands are actually kind of working together to some extent. It's kind of, they may be not working closely with each other because there is no like substantial threats to the system. But if there is a substantial threat coming in, they may kind of work more closely with each other to protect against the attack.
All right. Okay. So maybe I saw maybe there's still a lot of interest or questions to your talk, but unfortunately we are bounded with the time constraint. So if you wish, then maybe those who are interested can contact you directly and have more discussion on these very interesting topics.
Yeah, so
we are
further interest.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your talk and also the discussions. It's very great and wonderful talk. And have a good day. And we will be moving on to the next one. Thank you, Prof. Xiaofan.
Thank you.